Hello, everyone, and welcome to our partner webinar today. I'd like to introduce everyone to this session and welcome everyone from our community. Today's session is being brought to you by Scale Computing. Before we get started, I do want to take you through a few instructions on our console. This session is being recorded, so as per usual, we will have that available on demand at your convenience, and you'll get a link in about a day to view that. Also, we do have our live Q&A session, and for that, you need to just submit your questions using the Q&A widget located under the screen. We'll get to as many as we can, and if we miss any of them, we will follow up with you after today. We also have a handout available in the handout section, so take a look there for some more information. And finally, I want to invite you to the attendee chat. That's available using the orange icon buttons at the bottom of the screen, second from the right. You can open that up and start a conversation with your fellow IT pros. Remember, we do follow the community guidelines there, so keep it fun and professional. And at the end, we will announce our contest winner so everyone can get that information. So with that, I want to hand it over to Mike Lyon, Product Manager at Scale Computing. Take it away, Mike.
Thanks, David. And good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. I'm here in Indianapolis at our headquarters. My name is Mike Lyon. I'm a Product Manager at Scale. My main focus is really on our Cloud Suite and our MSP products. Happy New Year, belated everyone. I know New Year's a time that a lot of us take a few moments and make some resolutions. I resolved this year to not make any until February, so I wouldn't feel as bad about my resolutions not lasting as long as I wanted them to. So I'm not going to start making my habitual changes until next month, but I think all of us take some time at the beginning of the year. You know, it's resolution time, and we want to change our behaviors. We want to do something different. And I just kind of want to talk about some of our bad habits that tend to plague us as technologists, and how we can go about maybe breaking those and changing our behaviors. Quick background about Scale and who we are. We've been around since 2008. Our core product really is hyperconverged infrastructure. So what it is, it's modern virtualization. There's 1,000 different ways to describe it, but really we've provided a hyperconverged platform that's radically simple to manage, that's highly available, and that has world-class support. Those are three key things that you want in any core technology platform, and that's what we've been building, specifically designed for the SMB and for the mid-market. We didn't design an enterprise product and then neuter it of any value and features for a lower price point. We really wanted to have an enterprise-grade infrastructure, really so you can run a fully functional private cloud, if you will, to have that level of ease of infrastructure deployment where I'm just one-click deploying a VM and everything else on the back end is taken care of. And that's what hyperconverged infrastructure is really all about. And over the years, it's turned into a buzzword and then became the mainstream way of doing IT. We actually started in 2008 with a scale-out storage product, always with a vision of embedding that into a hypervisor. That's where hyperconverged is hypervisor converged storage. And we came to market with that in 2012. We even came up with a term, and it wasn't supposed to be a buzzword that was like an extension of converged infrastructure. It really was hypervisor converged infrastructure, where the hypervisor and the storage are in the same stack. And over the years, we've added features and grown. And last year was probably one of the most remarkable changes for us. As we started to expand into what we saw distributed enterprise / edge computing, as everyone's talking about, and what I call it is the race to the bottom. Really, we wanted to start breaking some of the old habits of using the one-use server as the canonical IT unit of infrastructure and looking at things like Intel NUCs or Lenovo Timeys or other smaller platforms where we can still run a full hyperconverged stack, whereas many others in the space can't. And that's really changing the way everyone's doing infrastructure, not just those edge deployments, but looking at different form factors and kind of breaking out of the first bad habit of just relying on that one use server as the way we measure and consume and spend and grow IT, because there's different ways of doing it. But let's talk about habits. We have to have a definition in here, of course. So Webster says that it is a settled or regular tendency or practice, especially one that is hard to give up. And I think that last part's what's most important. They become habits, and we call them that because we repeat them, and we don't want to change those behaviors. And I always use a joking example of, I actually heard this once. We never tested our backups just because it was a habit. We never set up a behavior to actually test them, so we would never bother to do it, and that became a habit. Good or bad, they're formed out of behaviors that we repeat. Things that are easy, maybe just a force of habit. We always say that when it's a behavior we repeat. But really, it's a way of creating practices that we have that become part of our reward system in our brains, right? We do something because we expect something back. I'm writing this script because it's easier. It's not the best way to do it, but I'm going to just deploy this script and keep on adding to it and not doing a good job of turning the script into something more robust or something that someone else could read. Those are things we start to establish practices around. And customs are even more ingrained because they come from us and they're built into us. So when we go to different IT shops or different jobs, we bring those with us. And whether they're good or bad, it's just those are the ways we've learned to write the script. We've learned to comment this. We've learned to carve out storage in a specific fashion. And those become patterns and routines, right? And so we begin to repeat those behaviors. And once they become repetitive and they committed to our brain, they become the routines and the habits that we live off of. And in IT, habits can be good and habits can be bad. But we're talking about the bad ones here. I think we could all name at least one. But other than the backup example I talked about, when I think about a habit, it's just a routine we adopt out of convenience or complacency. And honestly, complacency is the devil. It's the reason we hate documentation. It's the reason we want to read a quick start guide instead of a manual. It's because it's easier, right? And we tend to take our habits with us. Again, like I said before, when we come from other roles, other jobs, those habits that we form, we tend to bring with us and try to then adapt those habits to accommodate wherever we're working there or whatever project we're working on or new technology we're trying to learn. The habits become a part of our DNA. And then we use those same, habits and the way we do things. We start to do new things based on those. That bad script that really should be turned into something else is now just expanded and used elsewhere. And whether it's a good habit or a bad habit, we tend to form those based on existing behaviors we have. And my favorite saying, good habits are formed and bad habits we fall into. And good habits are formed because there's something that's the effort. That's the resolution. I'm going to stop using these terrible PowerShell scripts for my backup, and I'm going to deploy a product to do it instead. Bad habits we fall into because, again, it's about convenience and complacency. And we're technologists, we're going to take the path of least resistance. And as long as it's not violating any policies, that's what's going to be the easiest thing for us to do. And we tend to get fixated on those bad habits, not because we're bad people, but because it's the easiest way forward for us. And if we look at how that impacts, especially the hardware and the hosts that we're buying, we have a tendency to latch on to existing deployments and hardware far too long. Not even in the context of this needs to be replaced, but even after a new system has been stood up, we'll leave that there, maybe because we're having a challenge to migrate it, or maybe because we're still invested in routines or processes that we just don't want to migrate over and haven't, because there's a challenge to that. But that's letting us rely on the habit of using the old hardware and the old processes when there's something new or something better. And this makes, even just keeping that around and keeping that mindset of we're going to run it in parallel for a while, that really slows down the adoption, and it makes the migration effort not necessarily as critical or mission critical or as important. So then they get stuck dangling around, and maybe they aren't integrated into the backup routine or the new data protection structure we have. And then it becomes a single point of failure for something mission critical when you just spent 6 figures standing up a new, fully redundant HCI stack, but you still have to rely on an AIX box that you really don't know a whole lot about, but that's just been sitting in the corner working silently. We need to, when we're going through infrastructure refreshes and deployments, it's important to try and cut out as much of everything that's in the past as possible. Get the data off of there for compliance and to archive it, but you don't need that hardware. It's just going to become a minefield and another snake in the grass that you won't see when something breaks. Now, we're at Spiceworks, and a lot of us like to use the forums as a way to discuss vendors. And that's really the best place to do it, because we get fixated also in buying based on the brand. And maybe it's a habit that came from our technology rep at CCW or SHI, and they just continually force feed us the same vendor, or that's just who they're comfortable selling with. And maybe it's someone that you've been using for years, and it's the same version and the same product, but there's other more innovative approaches out there. It's just so easy to continue buying really based on a brand, when if you look at what you're buying, the actual product you're consuming, there may be better alternatives out there. And again, it's one of those habits where you have to be willing to stand up and say, all right, this is one of my resolutions. I'm going to look at other backup vendors this year. It takes time. And you really have to look at what's the value of the product that you're buying versus just the cost. Don't use one of the vendor-provided TCO tools necessarily. Look at what your total cost of ownership is for you and your organization. How much time and management overhead is there? What's the care and feeding cycle look like this? But most importantly, ask your peers. Ask here on Spiceworks. Look at genuine reviews. See how people are using it. See if anyone's used it in a way that you want to use it. And also make sure that you're looking at other, I say evaluate innovators, but, don't just look in the same 3 or 4 groups of vendors that you've been looking at. Ask your peers, ask on Spiceworks, look outside the top 3 search results from Google. Don't continue to look at a single vendor. And also thinking about, as I'm replacing this vendor, is it going to be scalable? Does this vendor have a licensing model that's going to suit what we can afford? Are they doing per core, per socket, per license, or per seat? Don't let a vendor grid, with a feature matrix ever sway you, because that's like, no one ever gives a bad reference for a job interview, right? The vendor is not the good source to get a comparative and comprehensive list of features. Talk to your peers. And don't also look at a vendor or exclude one just based on the size. There's a lot more to a vendor than what their stock price is. Look at what the product they're selling is. Look at what that value is to your organization and how much that's going to impact you. Again, Spiceworks is the best place to go, because you can ask peers, ask your colleagues. You can read reviews, but DM people and get actual conversations that didn't come from a review farm. And I think it's pretty easy to see nowadays what's actually a biased versus a truly unbiased and unsolicited approach. And Spiceworks is a great place to find those unbiased reviews. Spiceworks, Trust Radius, Gartner Peer Insight. There's a number of places to look for really well vetted and untainted feedback from customers. We're obviously very proud of what we have on Spiceworks, but again, that we're proud of that because it's got the credibility of coming from people in the community, and no one's going to give you better advice and results than your fellow Spice heads. Guarantee that. This would be another big resolution for everyone who's still using a traditional 3-2-1 / pyramid of doom, because in a way that the 3-2-1 architecture has created silos. And this doesn't have to be at infrastructure. This can be everything from your communications with your phone system, all the way up to, the financial accounting system. Does the software create these silos that you can't even easily support or understand? But starting with the infrastructure, are you spending today managing your servers and your storage and your virtualization separately? Because that's time consuming. It's costly. It's costly in terms of how much time you have to put into it, and those are costly components to buy separately, to license separately, to get support contracts separately, to make sure they're all co-terminating on the right date, so when you have to have your renewals due, to buy and provide data protection for those things. So infrastructure is a great example of something that can be siloed in a terribly inefficient manner. But again, software, if you look at what may be used, everything from your CRM and database tools to financial tools to application or your line of business specific apps. If those wind up being purchased or, there's a committee that buys that and just expects you to support it, that's creating a silo. It's creating a division because you're not involved in the purchase process, and you need to have, as a stakeholder, a voice and understanding, okay, this is software that's going to be, I realize it's for your organization, but I'm the utilitarian providing support for it. So I need to understand how this is going to impact me. Because otherwise you do wind up with departments that wind up even creating their own specific or separate budgets for software or even for infrastructure. And it just has a very negative trickle-down effect into how you have to spend your time managing those separate components or those separate software vendors on top of managing separate components. And if we just crack open and drill into the silo model a little bit, really it's looking at on servers themselves, your physical hosts, they all have their own unique support contract. They have their own lights out management interface and protocol. You've got to control and manage the local storage that's on there. And maybe that's where you've got your actual hypervisor installed. But you're managing those separately from what's likely you have some sort of shared storage component, a SAN or a NAS, which again, another support contract, another number to call. They have their own terminology and lexicon, so it's another skill set to evolve and have to keep up with. A significantly higher cost for providing redundancy and fault tolerance at the storage layer, because in most instances, the best and most sane approach to doing that is to just double down on your investment. So it's greatly adding to the cost of that. And then again, at the hypervisor level, that's another vendor, another piece of software to buy and license, to understand as their licensing models change, any other skill set, and then again, how do you provide redundancy at the hypervisor level, licensing or utilizing a separate site or their built-in data protection technologies. Again, you're treating that and supporting that in an entirely different manner as you would your storage silo or your physical hosts. And this is, at the infrastructure level, this is what made the cloud so appealing 10 years ago is it got rid of all this. It shattered these silos and said, okay, in a cloud, I can just log into an interface and I need a VM and I know what resources I need. And that's all I need to care about. Everything else is all taken care of underneath by the cloud provider. And that's what made that such a transformative experience. It was really that one-touch deploy, and taking that cloud-like experience and putting it on premises is really what hyperconverged infrastructure has done. And it's gotten rid of, the challenges in having to manage those different silos. So we talked about brand buying, and, on the other end of that spectrum would be too much diversity in your environment and having vendor explosion. And this can be the result of wanting to, POC and try a few different concepts, and then you just wound up keeping it or forgetting to return it, like I've done. This can be just as challenging and add just as much overhead. as anything else, and it really is a bad habit, because a lot of times you want to have diversity because it makes sense. I don't want to have all of my eggs in one basket. And if you think about the core tenets of your infrastructure, you've got communications, you've got your actual compute infrastructure. I need to add diversity there, but at some point, too much can be a bad thing, especially at the infrastructure layer. Adding diversity and having different SAN vendors and different physical hosts, that's not going to do anything except add confusion and complexity when you're trying to troubleshoot that. Which lights out management console do I need to log into? Which SAN console do I need to log into? Troubleshooting and dealing with even just firmware updates on those components, especially when they're all shared across a single stack, would be a nightmare. So there's no reason to unnecessarily diversify and add vendors in there. Change for the sake of change is not really always worthwhile. And it's important to ensure compatibility, not just in terms of are these going to work together, but as their update life cycles change and as their firmware versions change, are those going to be on a cadence that you can sustain and maintain? Can they be updated independently of one another, or is there a dependency that's being introduced that's unseen? There's so many challenges that really you don't understand, and there's so many landmines that we don't find until we step on them, that add to the challenges of supporting, dozens of vendors really for the same platform, to provide those compute services in your organization. Again, that was another big bright spot for the cloud, was it was one vendor for all of your hopes and dreams, for all of just that one console. So that was the hope that would solve all those problems. And especially in the support arena, having too many vendors has a huge impact on your maintenance overhead. Having to correlate all the different vendor products, their versions, their supported versions, even as something innocuous upstream might happen, like the end of support for Windows 7. That has a cascading effect on everything that's in your stack. And when you have diversity, the care and feeding of that stack can become really complicated. And then when you have to get on the phone and engage with someone, whether it's just for an update or a question or you're having a problem, how complex is that vendor engagement process? Are they giving you a lot of tools to help you be successful on your own? And then on the other side of that, is there someone there to help you when you actually need help and you need to speak to a human being? Or is that vendor going to realize that they're just one of many in a stack and try to deflect the responsibility of that onto someone else? And that's a sad reality, but, vendor, that circular finger pointing game, it's easy to get caught in the middle of that, especially when you're, not as homogeneous as you could possibly be with your infrastructure stack. Overprovisioning. Keep talking about the cloud again. This is where we thought, the cloud is perfect because it allows us to provision as we need. And honestly, that is a great selling point. It's consumable resources on demand that based on what you need. Whereas when we sit down, at an infrastructure refresh cycle, we've been burned in the past from the previous one where 18 months into it, we had used up double the amount of RAM and CPU cores than we thought we would because of, Project X had a new application to be deployed. So it's very easy to sit and be extremely conservative, again, rightfully so, based on the habit of being burned in the past by not having enough available, by not buying enough up front, because we're afraid about what's going to happen if I have to suddenly add a bunch of resources. Am I going to have to do a rip and replace of everything I've sized and put in place already? Or if I just need to grow, can I grow in specific and meaningful chunks in reasonable increments? If I just need to add compute resources, if I just need to add storage, can I do that? We've just been conditioned, and it creates this habit of grossly over-provisioning what is needed oftentimes for an initial deployment, whether it's a new site or a replacement. There's a lot of great tools that you can use, like live optics, to actually size and see what you're using today, even up to, in a 95th percentile view. And it's kind of eye-opening when we run these, we'll run live optics on customers looking to refresh their infrastructure. And it's often shocking to see just really, all right, my peak IOPS were 1250 during backups. My peak CPU utilization was 24 cores at 38%. It's kind of shocking to see how much is really not needed, especially when you're thinking about deploying, hyperconverged infrastructure. You can grow, and your solution, whatever you choose, really should be scalable by default. And the ability to grow should just be built in. It should not be an option. It should be an option to scale your environment based on a timeline that's going to meet your needs or your business needs, growth that matches those needs. And like I talked about, being able to grow in reasonable and I say meaningful increments relative to what you need. I don't want to have to buy a whole new storage node if I just need to add RAM. And those all really end up mixing together to create, a growth plan that doesn't require you to rip and replace what you have, or significantly overhaul even. Everyone always says rip and replace is drastic, but how easy is it to add in increments that I need when I need to do it? And is scaling that infrastructure going to break compatibility with other hardware? Can I do that in a seamless manner without disrupting my environment? And for us, that's important. It's in our namesake, and it really is about being able to grow your environment up and down. Again, talking about form factors that deviate from that traditional one-use size standard. Being able to grow your infrastructure at a pace and in a factor in a meaningful way for you. Even when you are sitting with those unused resources, they're just going to sit there and add a cost. They've got a sunk cost from what you purchased, from having to support them. Even when you're deploying a hyperconverged solution, you can kind of lose some of those gains if you wind up overbuying what you need. Don't let either vendor, and again, I'm not necessarily referring to the vendor selling you the infrastructure, but maybe even the software vendor, the CRM vendor that you're running is, giving you some, rather severe requirements. Ask for, what's the 95th percentile? Do I really need 64 gigs of memory for one VM? Probably not. But a lot of times, they'll publish those specs for VMs. Mostly, they're absurdly exaggerated from what they're needed, and that's done as a CYA. But when those get accounted for and put down on paper and planning, it does wind up pushing you to a state where I've bought more than I really need. So it's really important to just look at what your actual resource needs are, map those out, and then most important when you're planning for that, don't forget to figure in some overhead for data protection needs. And there's not going to be any perfect ratio of an extra 50% overhead of. And again, is that just going to be storage, or do I need to actually reserve compute resources, things like that? Think about your data protection needs, again, from the concept of not just data, but also disaster recovery, for getting a VM up and running, what actually needs to be run and protected. This one I had to add on because it's somewhat hit close to home. Middle school my son goes to was attacked by ransomware last year, and they were just under the assumption that their endpoint antivirus was going to be sufficient to provide them some sort of either intrusion protection or prevention. I'm not sure why they thought that was enough, but they were uninformed. And not that people don't have their eyes on how to protect ransomware, but I think out of our habit, we tend to overlook really how important having a specific strategy for ransomware is outside of your disaster recovery plan. Now, if you've got one already drafted that specifically addresses ransomware, that's great. You've already broken that habit. But we really need to create a habit of including a specific ransomware strategy to address that. And even nowadays, just like 15 years ago, it started to be written into a lot of insurance policies for disaster recovery plans. A lot of them now require specific coverages and plans to address ransomware specifically, because that's become far more costly than disasters have. But it's not always going to be a start from scratch. A lot of your DR products today are, if they don't already, they're going to be releasing them, have integrations specifically into their DR products for ransomware. Like I know ArcServe has a relationship with Sophos, so they're doing some endpoint protection as well as ransomware detection. Acronis has it with their Google machine learning virus engine, so they do ransomware detection. A lot of the DR products are starting to build in specific ransomware detection, even with some guarantees. So, look at whether it's new versions or new features that are offered. If you're at a point where you're looking at endpoint or looking at DR, take a look at what they can do for ransomware, because that may address any of those concerns. And again, it's going to keep it in the same, a single vendor, a single console, et cetera. It's going to make your life easier. Looking outside of that, thinking about actually at the VM level, protecting that outside of just the data inside of it really is the safest place, because your VM level and hypervisor snapshots are really going to give you the best, really the best and the most number of RPO options, especially if you've got some very granular, detailed ones, down to the minute. Using VM snaps is probably going to be a faster way than recovering the data from the backup archive. But the moral of the story here is really just to look at the fact that ransomware is very much alive. It's incredibly prevalent, and that a lot of insurance policies and business insurance policies are actually requiring that you've got a documented approach to ransomware, just like a lot of them used to require you had a documented DR plan. So if you're adding a new DR plan as your resolution this year, or you're going to refresh it, make sure you add in a ransomware test. And that's another one it's somewhat difficult to try and simulate, but if you're doing a DR test, you may as well include a ransomware test at the same time. Again, just to validate that actually works, because much like when a disaster hits, I don't think you want to be using the time to recover to actually going through your first ransomware recovery test. So just to break in a little bit, I was talking about hyperconvergence a lot and hyperconverged infrastructure. It's important because it helps us to break away and solve some of those habits, the bad ones that we've brought with us and developed and created through the years. And what does it mean? Well, it's the integration of the compute and storage and virtualization layers into a single solution architecture. Again, it's merging the hypervisor and the storage really into one layer. Because at the end of the day, the hypervisor today is really pretty much a commodity. What VMware can do versus Hyper-V and KVM. At the end of the day, there's pretty much parity into what the core x86 virtualization can do. What Scale wanted to do was look at how we can do it in a radically simple, highly available fashion. That was on our second slide. Radically simplified management and completely fault tolerant and highly available. In order to do that, the most complicated component of that 3-2-1 stack has generally been the SAN. If you can get rid of the SAN, now I can just run VMs on bare metal, essentially, right? So the way most people tackled that was just by virtualizing the SAN. All right, we'll just take the SAN and throw it into a bunch of VM disks and run it as a giant VM. So we'll have a small storage VM that's handling all that. The downside to that is that storage VM, because the SAN did so much, really takes a lot of resources. So really just to get to a point where you can create VMs, you're looking at 96 at a minimum gigs and up of RAM in a 3-node footprint, really just to get to the point where you can turn the lights on. What we wanted to do was simplify the experience, but rather than virtualize the SAN, what we built is a block engine. So that's really what makes Scale different, is the way we handle our storage architecture. There's not a actual file representing a VM disk, because our block engine allows the VMs to talk directly to KVM and then directly to the disks in a cluster without having to run a 24 to 124 gig VM to manage that storage. The other thing that allows us to do is work on extremely small footprints. That's why we can run on Intel NUCs with just 2 gigs of memory overhead. For iPhone users, I think I saw the latest iPhone 11s are using 3, and maybe the Pros have 4 gigs of memory. So we're using less than an iPhone in the smaller deployments. So again, getting rid of that VSA and simplifying that stack is really what makes us different. So at the end of the day, it's trying to get rid of this complicated stack of managing your physical host, managing your storage, managing your hypervisor, having some sort of management VM. Outside of that, really just wanted to simplify that and put it all into one stack. To the point where really the atomic unit of the data center becomes the VM and someday soon the container. But at the end of the day, it's that private cloud experience, except it's on premises. Right? It's a one-click deployment of VMs without having to worry about carving out and dealing with and managing the resources underneath. That's what our product is, Scale Computing HC3. It's taking the server, storage, and virtualization, putting that all into one stack. So again, it's a radically simplified experience designed to fit really any size from Intel NUCs up to multiple petabyte deployments and everything in between. But it's not going to require expertise on your part. You're not going to have to learn any technology. It's all built into a web browser interface that everyone can use. In fact, this is a good point. Let me just take a quick second and share my screens to show you what it is I'm talking about. So actually, one thing to point out, if you've noticed on our slides, for those of you who've seen us before, yesterday we did launch our new brand logo. So we're adding a little bit more color to things. That was with the orange in the presentation. And here's our new logo. But what we're looking at here is basically a 3-node cluster. And I have 49 running VMs. And this is my interface. This is where everything is managed from a central browser. Everyone's got access to a browser. It's the lowest common denominator to log in and get access to something clientless. But actually stepping back a little bit to get to a point where I can actually log in, create a VM, it's only going to be about 30 minutes. It's not going to be a multiple day engagement of setting up your storage, installing your hypervisor, setting up your physical hosts. Basically, it's giving each node a pair of IP addresses. The cluster initializes, and I've done a Spiceworks on the air broadcast where I had a cluster up and running in 27 minutes. So you can search through the archives to find that out. But really, if we think about the problems we had with our bad habits of vendor explosion, of siloing everything, a lot of those tend to vanish here because I've got a single interface where I can create a VM. I didn't have to specify anything about hosts or storage pools. I just had to tell it that I wanted a VM. And we can power it on and install Windows. We don't have to go through that process. But really, the moral of the story is to get to this point, it's about an hour and a half to 2 hours of your time, realistically, once you've unboxed everything. And from then, we can start creating workloads, and working to migrate workloads over. Also built in is, the ability you have granular control over your storage. Again, we do have most of our clusters or hardware has both a combination of spinning disk and SSD. So it gives you the ability to adjust the amount of SSD priority. So if you needed a disk and pin it all the way to SSD, crank it up to 11. If you need a disk to run on only spinning disk because it was not that important, you've got control over that. You can do that on live running VMs without having any impact. Also got built-in data protection. I can create schedules. And the schedules are just consisting of retention policies. Every 15 minutes, I've got some hourly, I've got some dailies. I can decide how long I want to keep those for. I can apply those policies. Our snapshots are actually file level, so it gives you the ability to go back in time. We had more than one, and I can get a specific volume out of a specific snapshot from a specific point in time. I don't have to necessarily clone or recreate the entire VM. I can just go back to a snap, pull a file out of a volume, and restore that back. All built in without any, there's no licenses, there's no additional software to install. This is all just part of the whole stack as a whole. Talked a little bit about this. Again, we've got, a data protection suite that's fairly comprehensive. We can back up to a single node. Again, that's also our starting point. It doesn't have to start at a cluster. We can deploy at the single node level. The only thing you lose is the redundancy of, having an actual cluster. And then, we can replicate to remote systems as well as we can run a virtual single node on Google's cloud. So that runs on GCP. So there's a lot of different options for data protection that we have available. We also have a partnership with Acronis. I mentioned them earlier. They do a great ransomware protection, but this would allow you to use Acronis and their central management console. They've got things like specific SQL agents, so you can do object level recovery from Exchange or SQL. They've got actual active ransomware protection, and then that's another way if you want to use existing hardware, maybe not as a part of your core business processes, but you can use external non-HC3 storage for backups. You can do the same thing with us, but we can only do VM exports. But this would also allow you to recover VMs to different computing platforms. So if you needed to recover to, a different hypervisor or a different physical host, you can do that. Talking about simplifying and cutting costs, we can use a single node as a compute endpoint, whether that's as a DR or backup target, or if you've got a multi-site deployment, we say distributed enterprise, but that's another option for you as well. So talked about Cloud Unity. This is just our built-in data protection suite for HC3. This is just really a monthly subscription that allows you to back up with full DR as a service on a monthly basis. But again, that's backing up directly to a virtual single node on Google's cloud. Highly encourage you to look at your reviews, both here at Spiceworks, but again, elsewhere. Tech Validate and Trust Radius are fantastic places to look for reviews on us. For everyone else, those are very sanitary and not vendor solicited. And again, just talking about for being able to fit in a variety of different sizes, going outside of the just traditional 1U rack mount form factor, with towers, with smaller desktop footprints, with the HC500, that's a half width 1U, half depth. There's a lot of different directions you can go to review your infrastructure. So I'm going to look at, I got a few questions here. Let's see, do we have a transfer current VMs from Hyper-V? So yes, we have a product called HC3 Move, which is OEM from Carbonite Move. So that does migrations from really any to any, P2V, V2V. You could also use native, your backup to do backups and restore from, either from Hyper-V, VMware, or existing cloud provider. So it's really easy to do VM migrations from any to any, even if it's running in the cloud. Amazon's got their own Cloud Endure, I think is what it's called, and that actually will let you migrate from AWS to to another system. So yeah, Cloud Endure would be what you'd use for 8 of them. Ryan asked how much. Well, I do have some pricing screens here. So starting at basically $5,000 for a single node. And again, you can deploy and run VMs as on a single node. A cluster really is about $15,000 to get started. So this is the HE500 series. We also have tower options. The towers are great DR targets just because you can do 8 drives in those. Fairly good for node density. HC1000, this is kind of our bread and butter, you know, the core of our product. These are based on Lenovo and Supermicro servers, variety of different processors and configurations here. I mean, you could do a cluster that had, you know, as little as 4 terabytes usable all the way up to, you know, a cluster with 1.5 petabytes usable. So huge variety of options as far as pricing goes. So then moving up the stack, these are HC5000s, much larger. These are 2U, you know, 12 to 14 drive systems, really great drive density. You know, these are getting you 1.5 terabytes of memory per node and, you know, up to 70 terabytes of disk. So these are much larger, but again, for the larger deployments and data centers, you know, these are used by MSPs as well. So another question, is there a demo I can get access to? Yes. We do have a weekly demo that's on Wednesdays you can sign up for. And then, you know, we're also, if you're interested, we're also going to be getting access to our HE150, so the code that can run on our Intel NUCs, getting to a point where you could actually purchase NUCs and then deploy us as a demo on there as well. So that's forthcoming soon. If you're interested about, you know, other use cases, we do have we just launched our new website. If you've been our old one, I apologize. Our new one is fantastic, and we've got actually outlined a wide variety of both white papers and use cases and case studies around different, you know, really different deployments. Everything from a traditional IT shop to manufacturing, government, higher ed. Let's see any more. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of the year and can take a few moments maybe just to think about what your resolution might be for starting in February 2020, because I think that's the best way to get them done. But that's how we can start with some new habits this year. I don't think we have any other questions coming in. David, is any other coming into the console there?
I think that's it for now. Let's see if any trickle in, but I do want to remind everyone that you can grab that brochure in the handouts to get some more use case information, as Mike mentioned. Also, again, if you want to review the demo that Mike presented, you're going to be able to view this on demand, so look for that link to come in about a day. So if that's it for questions, I'll go ahead and close up. Thank you, Mike, for all the information and the presentation. And special thanks to Scale Computing for sponsoring this great webinar today. I will kind of remind everyone, you can take a look into chat to see who the contest winner is. We can drop that in again now, and we'll have that information available in the community. So congrats to our winner. So with that, thank you everyone for attending. We'll look forward to another partner webinar with all of you soon. So until then, as always, stay safe and keep it spicy. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.